Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning as we talk about sharing. And we could probably take a lot longer than this morning as we've been talking about this panel and this very, very big topic. My colleagues and panelists have said, really, just 1 hour? This is an enormous topic, but we will keep it to 1 hour and hopefully be able to discuss lots of different dimensions of sharing, because it's a word that seems to be so much in the zeitgeist right now. So before we get into the discussion, I'd like to introduce my panelists. First, we have Chris Elliott, who is a consumer advocate, writes for The Washington Post, and is a multimedia journalist, and is really known as a consumer's best friend. Chris is coming out with a book in March called How to Be the Smartest Traveler. Next to Chris, we have Grant Greenberg from Regis, and as you probably know, Regis has been a real pioneer in collaborative workspaces, and Grant has a really unique perspective on what makes that business so successful and so relevant to people. And last but certainly not least, from Fast Company and Coexist, we have Ben Schiller, who has written extensively about the sharing economy and the collaborative economy. So gentlemen, to start, sharing is a very big topic. And if you could define within the sphere of what you do, how you would define sharing, and we'll start to use that to dimensionalize our conversation a bit. So Chris, how about you?
Sharing to my readers means interacting with a company. It means engaging. I thought that the statistics that were just shown were really interesting because there's an almost constant discussion about character. They don't call it that. It's more trust in the context of a customer service problem or issue. So, there is also as you said, the issue of sharing, the sharing economy, which is something that I've been writing about as well. But mostly when people think about sharing, they think about how I'm interacting with a company. And they're actually looking for, they don't look at a company as a brand. They're looking at a company almost as if it's a person. So they're rethinking, they're allowing this ability to share, redefine how they feel about a company or about a brand. And I think that that's really kind of the revolutionary part of this, is that there are so many different ways now of communicating with customers over social media and in person, that now sharing can mean so many different things, and people are making it basically what they want, which is they want almost a one-on-one relationship with a company.
Mm-hmm. And Grant, how about from your perspective?
For our perspective, sharing is all about collaboration. We live in a world now where between technology and people value work-life balance, we're seeing a lot more people work remotely. You're seeing dispersed workforces, or people starting their own businesses. But these people don't want to be isolated. And yes, they have social media channels where they could share, but they also want to be around other people. They want to be able to enjoy going to work. They want to be able to enjoy bouncing off ideas from one another. They want to be able to network. So the biggest thing we're seeing is the whole concept of shared space, shared collaboration, and shared resources, because there are tons of blogs out there and groups where you could learn information, but there's nothing better than you might be an accountant but not know how to market yourself. Mm-hmm. And in these shared spaces, in this collaborative world, you're seeing a lot more people sort of join forces and help themselves grow as a company and grow as a person.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Ben?
Well, I think the whole sharing economy, the definition of it has really expanded a lot since Airbnb, and it now covers sort of leasing and renting and borrowing and all kinds of collaborative behaviour. And I think it's really impossible to define properly. But I think two things are important. I think one is, I think proper sharing is really some kind of authentic peer-to-peer relationship between people. It's some kind of transaction. And I think there's also a kind of search for, from my point of view anyway, there's a kind of a search for efficiency. So it's about using assets that would otherwise not be used properly, like your room at home that you can put up on Airbnb, or your car that would normally sit in the street that you can give to someone when you go on vacation or something like that. I think that search for efficiency is important. Yeah.
And from your perspective, why do you think it's so current right now? What is it that makes the idea of sharing so much in the zeitgeist? What's happening culturally that's leading to that? Ben, do you want to
Well,
start?
I think there's, I would really point to the kind of millennial generation because I think they do think really differently from my generation or our parents' generation, and I think there's clearly a kind of an environmental aspect that's really important. I think people can see that the world is kind of falling apart, and there's this kind of hyper-consumption is not kind of healthy, and it's wasteful. And I think there's, to varying degrees, I think there's a response to that. I think also, I think if I'm being honest, there's a kind of an anti-big business aspect to this. I mean, we can argue about how legitimate that kind of attitude is, but I think it's definitely there in the kind of culture. And I think, again, I think there's a kind of, what was I going to say? I think sharing is quite empowering. I think it changes the relationship, the kind of transactional relationship. It's no longer kind of, big company over here and minnow kind of consumer over here. When you have a sharing transaction, your peers, your equals. So I think that's empowering for people. And I think millennials particularly, they enjoy the kind of control and the autonomy. I think they have that in other parts of their lives. So why shouldn't they have it in their kind of, consuming?
Well, if you're talking about the sharing economy, this is really nothing new. I mean, your mother always told you that sharing was good for you. So I think sharing has been going on since there have been people. What's different about sharing now, and when you hear about Airbnbs, I mean, this morning on NPR there was a story. It's like suddenly the mainstream media is waking up and realizing that there's this almost underground sharing economy. It's basically that people have figured out ways of monetizing the sharing that wasn't possible before, thanks to the internet or whatever new technologies, new platforms that they've developed. But people have been sharing all along, and so to call this something new might be a little bit of a stretch. What is new is that they're able to monetize it.
I mean,
I think there's
sorry,
also,
sorry, go on.
I was going to say also, I think there's also a different mindset. It used to be you had your own space, you had your own car, you didn't necessarily want to share it. If I was going away for a week, I wouldn't want to put my apartment on Airbnb, and if you worked in a company, you would want to have the corner office, and everyone else would try to get there. Now I think we also live in a much more open world where people are more willing to give, and while sharing existed, I think it's become much more accepted as well and more common.
Yeah, and the barriers to that, we were just talking about this before, are the incumbents, the companies that have so much to lose. I deal a lot in the travel industry, and it's the car rental companies that don't like Lyft, the limo companies. It's the hotels that are dead set against Airbnb and that are supporting the regulations in the state of New York to stop people from renting on Airbnb. So there's a little bit of tension, and that makes for a very interesting copy. But this kind of thing has been going on. I mean, I couch surfed in the 70s with my family. I mean, this is not new.
But I think the difference is the scale. I mean, I think the internet has really allowed this much more kind of serendipitous relationship building. I mean, with couchsurfing.org, I mean, you can go to hundreds of thousands of places all over the world and sleep on someone's sofa. I mean, in the past, you have to know the person to do that. So.
Yeah, well, that's exactly my point, is that now you have these platforms that allow you to do sharing, whereas before you maybe didn't have that.
So beyond the obvious economic benefits and the efficiency, Ben, that you mentioned and that you referred to or that you suggested with the couch surfing, are there other consumer benefits to this idea of sharing, and what's in the sort of the consumer mindset that makes it so appealing right now?
I can take that. I mean, I think there's definitely this sort of community aspect to it. I think people really want to feel that there's something larger than themselves. I mean, I've probably spoken to 2 or 3 dozen sharing companies, and often the kind of conversation will go, there's this economic benefit, there's this other benefit here, and then they will kind of come off in the conversation and they'll say, well, really it's about relationships, I mean, for instance, in the kind of food sharing space, I mean, food is kind of very available. I mean, there's no shortage of food. We can go to the supermarket, go to a restaurant or whatever. But there's some reason why someone wants to go to someone's house and break bread with them. And I think it's the kind of social aspect. And I think people are craving that because they spend their whole lives on cell phones, not talking to one another, on Amazon, buying stuff they don't need. I think they want to, interact with people,
There's also the social aspect of customer service and communicating between the client and the company, because people expect instant responses now. It's not you send an email and you hear back in 24 hours. If you have a problem, you're going to get better service if you tweet at a company. And I think that's a huge aspect too in the whole sharing world of, you also don't want that person to have a bad experience with your company, because then the whole world knows about it a lot quicker than they would have. So the sharing economy is great from the sense of word of mouth marketing and getting your name out there, but also you have to be protective of your name and your brand much more now.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about sharing in a broader sense, it is the sense, in the sense of sharing with your customers, sharing information. That's where all the action is, in my opinion, because companies seem to want to have it both ways. They have Twitter accounts, they have Facebook pages, and they say, hey, we're going to be social. And then, unfortunately, they'll do things like, if there's a critical comment about one of its products, they will censor it. They'll hide the comment on Facebook. Right. Or if someone tweets them out, they will only empower their employees to give a canned response. You know, please call us at this number, or please follow this link. And that's where, you know, going back to this issue of character that Andy was talking about, that's where character, there's this incongruity between character and what they say and what is actually happening. And that's what really upsets customers.
So we recently conducted a study, as you know, and many people in the audience may know, where we looked at the idea of brands and people co-owning or co-ownership, and the idea of what constitutes a shared brand. And one of the things that we learned was that it's very important for people to feel like they're being listened to, and that in many cases, social channels are coming up a little bit short because they're not listening and responding to people, and that when they do, people feel like they're more connected to a brand and that they start to own it a little bit more and they're sharing it. So I'd be curious for your perspective on that.
I think it's a real challenge for the companies, because I think people have an expectation of real authenticity, and I think a lot of these companies are just not set up. They just don't think in that way. You know, I think it's all about managing the message, and you know, the social media interaction is all about just being kind of freewheeling and, you know, winging it. So I think it's just chalk and cheese, really.
Go ahead. I think it goes hand in hand. I think as a company, you're trying to put out content that your followers and your audience is going to want to engage in, and put out as many messages as you can that they're going to find relevant without overwhelming them about everything the company does. So I think you're constantly looking for that happy medium. But I think also from the company perspective, you're also trying to get your audience to engage with you and finding similar pain points. So in a shared economy, especially say in Regis world, there's a lot of businesses out there that have the same pain points. So you want to get them to kind of share those and share their solutions. So I think that's a big thing that you go after too, is the shared experience that they have in common and the shared solutions.
Actually, if you would elaborate on that a bit, it's something we've spoken about in terms of some of the benefits to people that they have when you're sort of a convener of bringing people together to collaborate, and some of the benefits that I think that has some relevance to brands beyond ones that are sort of strictly sharing brands like yours.
I think there's a big thing is shared experience. I think that you're seeing so many companies now where they have people diverse and dispersed, I should say, where you might have a company where someone's in LA, New York, Miami, but you don't want to necessarily be at home because that's isolating, and you need to be able to interact with other people. So you have these open spaces, and it's a huge trend. You know, not just Regis has opened up hundreds of locations, but there are tons of other businesses. And the big trend we're seeing is, instead of just taking over floors and people putting in offices, these new places are creating a lot more open space. So while you do have your private opportunities, the big trend with all these companies is you're seeing a lot more open space, because it seems to be how people prefer to operate these days in that shared experience.
And why do you think that is?
I think part of it was what Ben talked about with millennials, and it's less hierarchical, it's less the corner office attitude, it's kind of come and go as you please. And people want to be social. It's not like you're working for one big company anymore. It could be a 2 or 3 person startup, and it could be a guy that branched off and created his own finance company, and you want to be able to engage with others. And I think that's just a huge difference now, as opposed to when people literally went into one company and worked their way up, and that was it.
I mean, do you think we'll eventually see the kind of end of the office?
I think in many ways, I think there's no one here that can't do what they do every day from the St. Regis.
Right.
that they go to their office to do. So I think in many ways you need that face time, you need that collaboration, because you still need to build relationships with people you work with.
Right.
But I think there are a lot of benefits to be able to maybe work from home one day, work somewhere close to home, sit on your balcony here and do a conference call is a nice way to live.
But Ben, you said something really interesting about this being a generational thing, about the millennials. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm Generation X, and my parents are baby boomers, and they think of work as very traditional, going into an office, stamping a time card, that kind of thing. You know, not to take over the moderator's job here, but it sounds like it's a shift, a generational shift almost.
Definitely. I mean, I think it started with, in 2000 with the original kind of .com thing. There was kind of a freeing up of some of these ideas, and I think it's kind of snowballed from there, and particularly with this new generation. I think they're just different,
Is there a way to reprogram the way? I mean, I'm really curious now. There is a way the way that we, us old fogies, think about sharing.
I don't know. There's probably some brain lab somewhere.
But there's definitely a big difference, though, in the generation gap of how people operate and what they think about, not just the jobs people do, but LinkedIn last week did a Bring In Your Parents Day. And that was to try to bridge the gap because they had done a survey and found that parents have no idea that, if I manage social media, what the heck does that mean? And that was the whole goal of the day, is to sort of bridge that gap. So I think that it's not necessarily going to go back, but I think it's an education aspect.
I think one thing I'd like to say about the millennials as well, I think they're making different choices about where they want to live. And I think the sharing economy is largely about cities, because you need that kind of density of like-minded people in order for it to work. I mean, like bike sharing in cities, they have to be a certain density in order for the thing to kind of operate properly. And I think millennials are saying, I think there was a survey recently saying that 70% of millennials want to live in cities, and they want that kind of, that density, that cosmopolitanism, that the kind of the ability to be less kind of environmentally wasteful, and that's only possible if you live in a more dense place.
So this idea of shared brands or the collaborative economy clearly is something that's very appealing. It's something, as we've all talked about, that has a lot of relevance, particularly for millennials and presumably for generations that are going to come behind them. Many people here work for companies or represent companies that aren't set up to be inherently sharing, like a Regis's or Airbnb and some of the other companies that you've referenced. How can companies who aren't engineered for their products or services to naturally be shared, what can they learn from the collaborative economy or from the shared economy that can be applied more widely?
Well, I kind of touched on this before, but if you're not empowering your consumers to speak at all, like if you have a policy that says no sending out tweets, unless you're involved in sensitive government security work, you should allow them to speak in a genuine way. And a lot of times what I find in the companies that I'm writing about is they only allow one or two people to speak, and they're overwhelmed. There's no way they can answer all of the tweets. So as a result, they're just sending out very canned and scripted responses that are not genuine, and people know that.
I would say two things companies could do and are doing. I think there are a lot of companies right now that are actually, I know for instance, Edelman, for example, one of their offices we work with, sort of changed the layout of their floors to make them more open, and now there's a lot more collaboration going on there. So it could be something as simple as just re-engineering, but also when you have companies that right now, most companies here, I'm sure, have offices spread out throughout the world, it's using social media to build relationships and interact. So I might be based in New York, and I work very closely with someone in Dallas, and we're constantly engaging over Twitter, and we've built up a very good working relationship and friendship just through having a good time, and we're the same company, same goals, but having some fun virtually outside of the office using social media channels.
As I said, I think it's a real challenge in terms of communication, and I think some companies are really built around hyperconsumption. It's about getting them to buy more toothbrushes or more lawnmowers or whatever. So it's a real challenge if people start to share, power tools or lawnmowers. But I think some of this thinking, this collaborative thinking, can be used in other parts of the kind of company. I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, in the very unsexy area of logistics, for instance. I mean, there's huge amounts of empty trucks that are going across the country at the moment. You take, goods from one location to another, and then the truck comes back empty. I mean, consumer goods companies could work together to make sure more of those trucks are fully loaded, or they could share logistics hubs or something like that. And that's a kind of an example of kind of collaboration that they could talk about in the media, even if they can't actually break apart their kind of front-end model.
I like the one-way analogy a lot because you're changing the way that a company thinks. So it's not a one-way conversation anymore. It's a two-way conversation. It's a conversation, and I think that it does require a mind shift within the company, almost down to the DNA level, in order to really get sharing. And you see a lot of companies that still think of, say, social media as a one-way conversation, a lecture, where we're just sending messages out about we're branding, or we're trying to generate new business or whatever, but they're not listening.
And you must see that a lot from your experience, that companies are very busy, as you say, pushing out content. And as content has become so much of what so many of us in this room do in helping to engage people in conversation, is that perhaps we're only going about halfway in that conversation because we're not listening. And that people feel like we're saying me, enough about you, what do you think of me?
That's true, yeah. And I think there are people at the lower levels that do understand, because they're reading all of the tweets and they're reading the Facebook posts and whatever, the blog comments. But I think a lot of them feel hamstrung by people at the upper levels saying, well, we can't do this, this is not our messaging, or this is not our policy. Why? Well, we've always done it that way. And then you have people at the lower level pushing back, saying, but this is social, it's different. Sharing is the new thing to do, and there's maybe a little bit of tension there. But when I talk to people who are doing customer service, they understand because they are listening, but they're not always able to act. So not to beat the dead horse here, but if you empower your customers to really speak on behalf and to take action, a lot of times people on the customer service side don't have the ability to really make a difference, to resolve a complaint. And so if you allow them to do that, social will work really well in your favor. Otherwise, I think it could hurt your brand, because you're saying, the door is open, let's have a conversation, and then you don't have the conversation.
So do you think that customer service and marketing and people who are owning social channels and community managers need to be more closely linked together, perhaps, than they are within companies?
Well, in the minds of consumers, these are all the same thing. Marketing, PR, even customer service, they're talking to the company, and they want a response, and they don't care which department it's coming from. They just want the answer. So you have to really, I think of this from the consumer's perspective. When I tweet out your company, you generically speaking, I'm not interested in whether the lawyers had a chance to review the response before it was sent back to me or whatever.
Right.
I just want an answer.
I mean, you're the PR expert, so you should maybe give some advice about how companies should be more attuned to these things. But I think, as a journalist, we get a load of press releases every day, and half of them say we're part of the sharing economy, and after a while you become quite skeptical about those claims, because a lot of those ideas, a lot of those press releases aren't really sharing. There's some attempt to bandwagon, really. So I think that this is a kind of sensitive area, and I think people are quite protective about this sharing idea. So I think if there's one thing I'd say, I think tread lightly. Don't just sort of pile in there too quickly.
It's like the late 90s when everyone had .com at the end of their company, and suddenly they got all their funding. I think sharing is a dangerous buzzword.
Why is that?
Because it can mean so many different things. We have had several conversations about what sharing means, and it can mean so many different things depending on where you're sitting. And I think it's a buzzword in the sense that it really is meaningless unless you sit down on a panel like this and really discuss it. Who has an hour to do that,
Also going back to your point about the sharing and the difference between the different departments and so forth. When you work in a company, you have the higher-ups who've been there for a long time, and they don't understand why you're pushing out content that's maybe tips that'll benefit your users or your consumers. It should be about your company and what you do. And really, to the consumer or to the follower, they're much more engaged in the content when it's not about your company. It's more about how the information can help them. And I think that's also sort of a divide too right now when you're bridging the gap to make your company or your higher ups realize there's value in becoming a useful source and sharing useful information versus just pushing out company.
Anything you want to add, Ben?
Sorry, what was the question?
Actually, why don't I ask a bit of a different question, which is that a lot of what you've talked about is empowering people, and we've talked about big companies and how perhaps it's a little bit difficult for them to shift. And Chris, certainly you've talked about empowering people within those companies and making them more accessible to consumers because consumers don't care who from the company, they just want their problem solved. And so my question is, do you think that people's expectations of companies has shifted as we've had this more democratized dialogue?
Well, this is one of the perils of the sharing. The idea of sharing is that suddenly you are thinking of a company as a person, and so you're expecting a more compassionate response when you're asking an airline to waive a change fee. I get requests like that every day. Someone gets sick, someone breaks a leg, and they want an airline to issue a refund on a non-refundable ticket. The policy is very clear that airlines don't do that, but there are exceptions made, and when you tweet out a company, an airline, and you ask for that, and you think of that company as a person, you expect that person to have compassion. So the bar is raised. You're not looking for an automated response. You're looking for a real person to take a look at your case and say, we feel bad for you, here's your money back. And if that doesn't happen, people are very unhappy.
I think it almost goes back to Ben's point too with everyone's equal. You don't look at the company anymore as you're the big guy, you get to treat me like this, you should treat me equally. And I think that's a big thing that companies have to adapt to. You have to be a lot more fair and reasonable, and that one-size-fits-all policy I don't think is working anymore, and that generates a lot of complaints.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you want to be kind of deep about it, I mean, I think there's a kind of there's a kind of shift away from these kind of top-down hierarchies in all kinds of aspects of life. I mean, I think in politics as well, in government. I mean, I think people don't have the same trust for the kind of top-down structures as they used to. It's the same with businesses. I mean, we were showing that survey this morning with 5% of Americans trust corporations. I mean, it's pathetic, you know. So I mean, that's going to be a hard road for companies to come back from.
What do you think is next from a consumer standpoint, and what do you think is going to be next in terms of people's expectations of companies now that people do feel more empowered, now that there is this democratized dialogue? Look into the crystal ball a little bit.
I mean, I think this sharing phenomenon is going to kind of stretch out to new categories. I mean, I think one area that I'm really interested in is finance. I mean, I think obviously after the crash, there was a tremendous amount of annoyance and displeasure towards the banks, and I think there should be a groundswell there for kind of more peer-to-peer kind of finance. When I was speaking to an insurance company in Germany last week, and they have a peer-to-peer insurance model, so that it works like you have 10 people, and they kind of create this kind of group, and any kind of insurance claim up to 50 euros is taken care of within the group, and only then only after 50 euros is it taken out to the kind of normal channel. And the advantage of that is that it kind of reduces fraud. You get less claims that go to the insurance company, and it's kind of self-regulating. But the point is that, I mean, if the German insurance industry can do peer-to-peer sharing, and I think anyone can, and I think we'll see peer-to-peer lending is going to be a big thing. It has to be, and there's all this kind of money out there that's not being used, and I think it's just a question of kind of regulation. I mean, nobody would have thought that crowdfunding would take off like it has. I mean, it's billions and billions of dollars, and now we're going to get kind of equity funding as well, which is kind of when you actually take a stake in the company. I think eventually we'll see sort of percolate out to these, even to these industries that you wouldn't necessarily think of as kind of sharing places.
Any
Yeah.
in particular that you think might be next beyond finance, from what you're seeing?
Well, as I said, I think something like logistics, I think it
Yeah.
makes sense, you know, or, you know, I heard the other day that Puma, you know, the footwear company is thinking about doing a kind of leasing model for footwear, which is something you would never think of. I was talking to a company the other day in Netherlands, they're doing jeans leasing.
They have it for dresses, bridesmaid dresses now, so that
Right.
girls don't have to buy the dress.
Exactly, and I mean, they're doing the jeans because, I mean, these are very high-end jeans. I mean, they're $200 jeans, but they're made of, you know, organic cotton from Turkey or somewhere. So, but the advantage of the leasing is that the guy can take the stuff back and he can recycle it, you know. And I think and people are buying into that because they like the idea of this thing definitely being recycled and reused. I think there's a certain niche there that's definitely exploitable.
Do you think that this then represents new revenue streams, possibly, and just new ways of making products accessible to people? Not everybody can afford a $200 pair of jeans, but people sort of leasing jeans, that it just opens up.
I think
new
people are also
consumers.
interested in buying products that they know are going to be kind of taken apart afterwards. I think there's a move away from these products which are kind of, you know, with unbreakable screws on the back, which is just going to kind of disintegrate into the environment and do terrible damage. I think there's a shift away from that. Yeah.
I think it's also a lot easier for people to make money these days. You can monetize things like you talked about through the internet. So I could make money by renting something out that I own. I could also save money thanks to the shared economy by even something as simple, you know, there's a new app where you could just borrow something, find someone nearby who might have a hammer you need or a drill. So instead of going to buy a drill, I can go borrow that drill, or, you know, spend $5 to borrow that drill instead of going to buy a new one. So I think it saves people money and also is a great opportunity for people to make some money.
So it seems like that's a real conundrum if you're the hammer company. How do you monetize and how do you take advantage of this or capitalize on people's interest in sharing in a way that makes money for you, is something for them to think about, whether it's the $200 jeans or the hammer?
Well, when I think of Grant's example of the tool, I think of the tool library in Berkeley, where I'd spent a few years, and you could go and borrow a power tool or leaf blower or whatever, and that was back in the 90s, in the early 90s, when I was in school. So that's been going on. Maybe I'm just a little skeptical here. I know that it's a lovely buzzword that we have, sharing, but I recall Web 2.0 a few years back when everyone was going crazy about Web 2.0. We had panel discussions and everything like that. So when I look to the future, I say, I see people doing much more peer-to-peer, because I think that really is, as the other two panelists here pointed out, there are a lot of great opportunities here that have not been exploited yet. But I don't think we're going to call it sharing. It's just going to be what we're doing. You know, we'll come up with another term that we can talk about, you know, in another 2 or 3 years.
Right.
But I think that we're going to see a whole lot more of it. For me, on the other side of the sharing discussion, I see consumers having much more access to information and sharing that information with each other. So you already see this when a company sends a form response, usually a form rejection, that is now getting shared online with others, and that they then say, oh yeah, that's obviously a form letter, so you can't fool the company, you can't fool your customers into thinking that you just sent them a beautiful letter saying, no, I'm not going to issue the refund for that ticket. That was a form response. You see a lot of people, one of the most popular areas on my site is a database of companies where we actually, volunteers and I have gone out and researched the names of all of the top executives, the CEOs, the head of customer service, their email addresses, and oftentimes we have their home phone numbers too. So that if the chain of command doesn't work, if you try to go through the customer service process and you still fail, you tried tweeting them out, you tried posting to Facebook, nothing works, you can always call the CEO. They love that part of the website. But that's the kind of information sharing that is going to, I think if anything, it's going to put more power in the hands of your consumers. And it's going to be more disruptive for companies.
I think companies also are going to have a tougher task. They're going to have to distinguish themselves to make themselves better. So we talked about the hammer as an example, or lending money. A bank is going to have to be able to prove that they are the more reliable person to go to, or that hammer's worth buying, or, for instance, in Regis's case, you're better off coming to this established company where you know what you're going to get versus, if you had office space and were traveling for a month and might rent out your desk, you don't know what you're getting. So you need to be able to establish yourself as a reliable brand as well, that people are willing to spend the money or go to that company because they know what they're getting versus what you may not know what you're getting in the shared world.
Right. So, when City Bikes came out in New York City, a lot of people who owned bike shops and some of the bike manufacturers were quite nervous that this was going to put the end of bike sales. And in fact, just the opposite happened, is that new people got exposed to biking and sort of liked taking the blue bikes out for a bit of a twirl, that actually there's been a boost in sales of bicycles in New York City, in the New York City area. And do you think that people having access to trying new things because they can this is almost becomes a different way of trial or sampling for kinds of products that can lead to greater success for companies?
Definitely. I mean, I don't think the car manufacturers are as happy. I mean, and presumably, if everyone's biking in the city, they're not buying a car.
Or not taking a taxi because they get bike to work.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
But I think giving them a taste of something, like if you give an employee a taste of working from home for a day a week, or working in a shared space versus having to travel an hour to commute, or that experience, they're going to truly appreciate it. And some of these things you really do have to try to see, there is a difference, and that impacts my lifestyle, or it makes my life better, and it saves me money. So I do think there's definitely something I was afraid to ride a bike in New York City. I rode City Bike. It wasn't so bad after all.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a short-sightedness among the incumbents, the people who do have the most to lose, the hotels that are unhappy about Airbnb, the car rental companies or the limo companies that don't like Lyft or relay rides, because they don't want to lose out in the short term on business. But I think that in the long term, you already see companies like Enterprise that have embraced sharing, and they have their own company. Hertz has just acquired a company that does sharing too. So that if you can get past the idea that this is a threat to your business, that sharing actually can be good for almost any company.
So how do you get by the fact that, or how do you get by a mindset of it being a threat?
Well, I think maybe that's the job of PR, is to communicate internally that this is not a problem. This is a good opportunity. But I know that we're trying to write about it, the benefits of it. I mean, the benefits are not always there. Airbnb has plenty of consumer complaints. I get them all the time. But there are some benefits that maybe don't get talked about or get downplayed.
But I think the real point is what it shows, this whole sharing economy thing shows, is that there's been this kind of shift in consumer attitudes and expectations. So it's not so much whether X platform takes off and is the next Airbnb. What it shows is that kind of model is possible, and a certain number of people are very kind of find it very appealing. So I think companies can't put the cat back in the bag. They have to embrace it, and they have to kind of adapt in their own way. And as I say, I don't think that's always going to be in their kind of frontline product and service. If you're making toothbrushes, you want to sell more toothbrushes, but there may be other aspects of the business which you can kind of adapt to this kind of new way of thinking.
I like what he said about the way of thinking, because it really is. It changed the way that you think about your business and about sharing. It's not just about your product, but it's about how you also interact with your consumers.
Definitely. And would you say that there is truth? One of the things that marketers often will say is that we no longer own the brands, that people own our brands, and that people are much more owners of our companies, not just the products that they buy. And would you say that there is in fact truth to that, and that people's expectations of their roles with companies have elevated as a result?
I think it's true in the sense that the consumers have more power now maybe than they've ever had. But to say that the brand is owned by the consumers, I don't know. That sounds a lot like
Not quite yet.
marketing speak.
But I think that the brands do have to listen to the consumer and adapt more, so that the sharing economy isn't a passing fad. The car rental places, the hotels, they need to adapt to meet that. So I agree that the company still owns itself, but I think there's a lot more input, and they're taking those consumer comments into consideration in how to design their next space, their next product, and so forth.
Can I just say something about this kind of these these legal fights, which we're going to see lots and lots more of these things, with Airbnb in New York and so on. I mean, the sharing economy, the leaders, they're now forming their own kind of lobbies and trade associations, and they're behaving more like traditional companies, and they want to present themselves as this kind of David versus Goliath type thing. But I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, there are sort of bed and breakfast, mom and pop places in New York which have gone through the kind of licensing process, which don't deserve to be put out of business by some, sharing website. So I think there's a bit more kind of complicated than kind of small company versus big company, as I kind of like to present it. Anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should call it the listening economy instead of the sharing economy.
Right.
Okay. The responsive economy, the response economy.
Doesn't have quite the same ring to it, though,
not
as
quite
the
yet.
sharing economy.
So one last question before we turn it over to questions is, if you're a company like an Airbnb, for example, or a company where your product is one that's shared and you don't have necessarily a lot of control over it, is there a certain dynamic? So your reputation is built on a product that you don't necessarily control, and are there lessons and pitfalls in meeting people's expectations?
Oh, absolutely. Airbnb is a complex process from the end user perspective. You have at least 3 separate refund policies when you rent a room on Airbnb, and people often arrive at their rental and discover that they haven't gotten what they thought they were going to get. Maybe the photos were a little bit, I don't want to say doctored, but there's no one verifying that that's the actual photos. You can come in with a wide-angle lens. Right. That's right. So yeah, there's going to be problems down the line. There already are problems. But if you think about it, though, there are all these rooms now that are available to millions of people that were not available before. So that is a good thing, and that the trade-off is good. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have a couple of unhappy people. But quality is definitely going to be another issue in the future, because again, if you're letting someone use your car, did you clean the car? Mm-hmm. Is it well maintained? Is it not? Who's going to check to make sure it's well maintained? If someone is giving you a ride, are you a safe driver? How many accidents have you been in? How do you verify something like that? Those are questions that are all right now being answered. Mm-hmm. And in the old days, you would just take your chances. You would hitchhike, and maybe you would get there, and maybe you'd have maybe not. I don't know. Maybe like one of those horror movies.
Yeah, exactly. Excellent.
Well, I think the risks have been kind of overblown. I think people have been saying this for a couple of years. Oh my God, we're going to go and share food with one another. We're going to get food poisoning and all that sort of thing. I think by and large there haven't been lots and lots of problems with this. I mean, I think it's as long as you follow the rules, I think.
Also, wasn't that the case with eBay too? People were scared of buying stuff from other people. Exactly. eBay has proven very successful and reliable.
And that kind of, the rating system is, solves most problems,
Terrific. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much and turn it over to questions from our audience.
Good morning. I was interested to hear the panel's discussion on airline tickets. That it kept coming back to the passenger tweeting the airline to get the non-refundable ticket refunded. And as someone who was on the receiving end at an airline for some years of that type of those types of complaints, I have to say I think you're right that it's important that the sort of corporate speak doesn't come through in the reply, but I do think that airlines should make people aware that by doing so, by refunding a ticket for someone who may have all sorts of circumstances that might convey a very good reason to, at the end of the day, is unfair to the passengers who pay for the full flexibility on their tickets. And I think at the end of the day, the customer has an obligation to buy the right ticket for the right reason and to take out insurance where they're buying a non-refundable ticket. So I hear you, but I think it's very important that we don't let this go too far. If we're going to start saying that airlines should refund every ticket from every passenger who feels, for whatever reason they've broken a leg or whatever, then I think the system for the overall consumer is actually going to be a very unfair one, because for me, who pays for flexibility on a ticket, I'm disadvantaged. I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Well, thanks for that question. You're absolutely correct. People should be buying a flexible fare, and people should be buying insurance, and that's really what I do on my site and in my practice as a consumer advocate, is that I tell people, here's how you could have prevented this from happening. You could have bought an insurance policy. You could have bought a full flex ticket. The problem with that, as you know, and I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole, is that the full flex tickets cost between 3 and 4 times more than the restricted economy class advanced purchase fare. And the insurance that you would buy when you're on a website, and then it tells you, would you like to protect your purchase, is a very restricted named peril policy that would not apply to many of the situations that passengers find themselves in. For example, let's take someone with a cancer diagnosis. If that cancer diagnosis, no matter how grave, is a pre-existing condition, then insurance would not cover it. So my point is not that airline tickets are unfair. We can debate that afterwards. I would love to debate that with you. My point is that people are looking to the company as a person and not as a company, and they would like a compassionate response often. Not always. Sometimes they just want to high five or shout out or something like that. That's fine. But they have stopped thinking of a company as a monolithic thing that speaks in canned responses. That was the point I was trying to make.
I'm not sure if you're actually going to be able to answer this, so here goes. Really interesting discussions and great concepts. How do you see these ideas applying in a sort of business-to-business communications context?
What do you mean by business-to-business communication?
So, I don't know, the sort of business-to-business element of, so when businesses are with businesses rather than, a lot of the discussion was around the sort of the interrelationship between consumers and business, but a huge amount of business in the world is done between businesses. Thanks very much, and especially gentlemen from Regis, you're gonna. I thought you might have an interesting view on how that sort of works.
We actually engage a lot behind the scenes with the companies. So for instance, we have partnerships with Zipcar, with different hotels, with different airlines, and we try to create relationships behind the scenes via social media. So we might share their content, they share our content. So it's not just a blind tweeting and including someone. I think that's been a really big positive, is building that relationship behind the scenes. And then you hopefully have to get them to buy in, because there are some major companies that, for instance, use Regis, but for one reason or the other, they may not want to publicize it. So you have to be fair, and you don't want to alienate someone or make them angry with your company. But I do think there's a lot of relationship building that goes on behind the scenes to help one another promote and interact and engage.
Other questions? Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, Paul.